This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado Chapter of the Nature Conservancy and TNC chapters throughout the western United States. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the last Tuesday of every month throughout 2024, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions in the American West and beyond. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in the West and around the world, visit www.nature.org. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guests today are Celene Hawkins and Izabella Ruffino. Celene is the Colorado River Tribal Water Partnerships Program Director for the Nature Conservancy, and Izabella is the Tribal and Indigenous Engagement Program Manager for the Colorado Chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Both Celene and Izabella use their skills to advance and support tribal-led land and water conservation work throughout the American West. Most of Celene's work is centered around the Colorado River Basin, and she's played an important role in many cutting-edge water conservation projects that have sought out tribal voices and indigenous perspectives to create some of the West's most effective and equitable solutions to complex water challenges. Perhaps most notably, she worked with the Jicarilla Apache Nation, the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission, and her colleagues at TNC to create a first-of-its-kind water agreement that was a true win-win for nature and people. Izabella's work builds on TNC's strong foundation of partnerships with tribal nations for land and water issues, and she's also focused on expanding tribal and indigenous engagement into all aspects of TNC's wide-ranging conservation work. Additionally, she's responsible for internal efforts to fortify organizational cultural awareness and humility within TNC's Colorado chapter. As you'll hear, Izabella is doing everything from leading internal educational initiatives to working with stakeholder groups on projects such as determining the best uses for TNC-owned land and preserves. In this episode, we dig into the details of many of their specific projects and initiatives, but we also talk more broadly about the importance of seeking out indigenous perspectives to help guide TNC's critical conservation work around the world. They both offer plentiful resources, online courses, books, podcasts, essays, and more that will help me and you, the listener, better understand the importance of bringing together diverse perspectives to guide the next chapter of conservation work in the West and beyond. Celene and Izabella mentioned so many excellent books, people, and resources, so don't forget to check out the episode notes for links to everything. A big thanks to both of them for such a fun, inspiring, and educational conversation. Hope you enjoy. Well, Celene and Izabella, I'm so excited to be chatting with y'all. We had a fun conversation preparing for this, and we should have just recorded that and put it out as the podcast. But I'm really excited to hear all the details about all the work you're doing. And so I think when we have more than one person on the podcast, I think it's good to kind of start out just with intros so that people can know who the voice is. And so Celene, I was wondering if you could just start out and just give a brief intro of what you do at TNC and kind of what the overarching, role that you play within the organization is.
Thanks, Ed, and I'm just thrilled to be here today. I'm a big fan of the podcast. So I'm Celene Hawkins, and I work as the Nature Conservancy's Colorado River Tribal Water Partnerships Program Director, which is a mouthful, I'm aware. And I work on our Colorado River Basin team to support tribal partnerships work all over the Colorado River Basin. And I think a good way of explaining what I do might be to explain a little bit about how I think about the challenge that we're facing in the Colorado River Basin. You've talked to some of my colleagues, including my team lead, Taylor Hawes, about the incredible water stress that we're under in the basin. But we actually have a bit of a dual crisis in the basin, and it has to do with the 30 tribal nations that call the basin home. these tribal nations have the legal rights to about 25% of the water in the basin. But until a few years ago, they were excluded from nearly every governance and policy-making space in the basin. So a lot of the work that we're doing is building relationships with tribal partners, making sure that we're good partners in the basin, and really thinking about how to build durable and equitable solutions that recognize the role that tribal nations and their water already play in the basin, and really looking towards solutions that are Indigenous-led. So almost all of my work is centered around that. I can tell you the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day, but I think that's a good overview.
No, that's perfect. And like any good statement, it gives me a bunch of more questions to ask, because I have so many more follow-ups from what you said, but we'll definitely get to it all. Izabella, can you tell us a bit about your job at TNC?
Yeah. I just want to say, Ani, Izabella, Indigenous, Makwa, Dodam, Anishinaabe. I just introduced myself in my language and just saying, hello, my name is Izabella. I am Bear Clan. I am Anishinaabe, and I'm from the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe. And my role at TNC, a little bit of a mouthful as well, but I'm the Tribal and Indigenous Engagement Program Manager for the Colorado Chapter. And a part of my role is to help build on our strong foundation of partnership with tribal nations in our water work, which Celene just outlined and she has been such a champion of. So huge thanks to her. And also expanding the tribal and Indigenous engagement to all aspects of our conservation work. Because this work is really cross-cutting, and it's important to have that voice carry throughout our work. In addition to building external relationships, I'm responsible for building internal cultural awareness and humility. We're shifting towards these terms instead of cultural competency, because, we're realizing that this is a learning journey that's continuous. So wanted to frame it that way. And this is going to be for our Colorado business unit staff. So as a part of this, along with my tribal and Indigenous engagement team, we're developing and providing a tribal and Indigenous learning journey. And we have a couple different elements of that. We'll be bringing in different speakers, streaming Indigenous films, and have field trips to highlight different initiatives and issues that tribes and Indigenous people are facing. And I also want to say, thank you again for having me here, and doing this with Celene is such an honor. So I am also a fan of the podcast. I think I told you when we first met that it's funny to hear your voice and also be on the other end of it, because I feel like I'm just listening to another one of your podcasts. But really excited and honored to be here. So thank you.
No, I'm the one that's honored. I mean, and then I get, when I hear that smart people like y'all listen to the podcast, it makes me really, really nervous. Oh no. And I hope you're as much of a fan of the podcast after we finish this as you were before, because you never know. Well, I could ask questions for many, many hours, but I want to be so respectful of y'all's time because you're doing such important work. And I was thinking, one of the, maybe a pretty efficient way for the listeners to get an idea of some of the work, Celene, that you've led, is to talk about the recent agreement that you played a big role in down in New Mexico, because I feel like that's such a case study that of collaboration, of creative thinking, of working on a project that seems, I would imagine at the beginning, seemed just almost overwhelmingly challenging, but being able, through partnerships and being very smart and just really endurance, you were able to come up with this really groundbreaking partnership between tribal nations, TNC, the state of New Mexico. And so I was wondering if you could just give an overview of that project, and just maybe start out with how did it come to be?
Yeah, and there's actually a couple of ways I could answer this, but the sort of longer view, I think, is that for my entire career, I've watched the Colorado River Basin develop tools and water conservation programs to try to get a handle on the overall sort of imbalance between supply and demand in the system. So we've developed a series of programs over time in the basin to help people figure out how to use less water without taking as much of a financial hit or otherwise in the basin. And, we've been doing this for decades in the Colorado River Basin, and the programs have consistently not worked for tribal nations in the basin. And some of this is because those programs are really designed to ratchet down existing water use. Like they want to put wet water back in the system and make sure that there's real impact if we're paying, for example, for people to use less water in the system. Mm-hmm. But this has really left tribal nations out of the solution space for a long time. And I really think that's the context where I worked with Daryl Vigil, who currently co-leads the Water and Tribes Initiative in the Colorado River Basin, but was the water administrator for the Jicarilla Apache Nation. And I think he and I had been talking about that issue for a decade when we started to think about that project. I think the sort of response you might have expected was that I think that the project came to be because the Jicarilla Apache Nation lost a really important revenue source when they lost a water lease for their water to be used in coal-fired power production a few years ago.
Okay.
That was a multi-million-dollar revenue stream for the nation. It was very important to the health of the government and the community. And so I think a lot of people, definitely everybody on our project team between the nation, the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission, and the Nature Conservancy, saw that there was a really big opportunity to replace that revenue source without transitioning that water to another use where it wouldn't be providing system benefits. So I think we were all thinking, that is a huge chunk of water that's just been freed up and the nation needs a revenue source. Could we build something for that water to be used for a number of purposes, including the environment in the San Juan River Basin? And I think that was really how it started. And I don't think any of us knew exactly what the deal would look like at that time. I'm not even sure that I was there for the first conversation about this deal. But I do remember really vividly sitting down for a cup of coffee with Daryl and his attorney, Jenny Dumas. And I remember it because I had an 8-month-old at home and it was my first big trip away and I was feeling very torn. And I walked out of having that cup of coffee thinking it was worth it to be away and we're about to build something big together.
One question about that, about what you just described, when the coal power plant went offline, did that just happen as we're seeing all over the place as coal is kind of being phased out? Is that why that coal power plant went out of production?
Yes. The San Juan River Basin is in the middle of a really big transition for all of its communities around energy right now.
I think that speaks to the complexity of all of it, because I think most people listening to this, probably think a lot about renewable energy, but that's an example of one of the many trade-offs. It's not like you can just snap your fingers and switch it and there's no problems. I think I think it's always good to be reminded of the complexity of all this stuff. And so looking back at, if I'm correct, if my research was correct, the deal went into place in 2022. So you've had a bit of time to, kind of think about it and think about how it all came together. As you were going through the process, what were some of the kind of ups and downs that came? Were there any sticking points where you thought, oh, maybe this deal isn't going to come together? Or were there any opportunities or examples of kind of collaboration, things coming together that maybe you didn't expect? I'd love to just hear kind of some stories from the negotiation part and really just hammering the deal out.
Yeah, and it was such an interesting deal to work on, really because I see it as fundamentally a deal between two sovereigns, the state of New Mexico and the Jicarilla Apache Nation. The Nature Conservancy is a signatory to the agreement in part so we can bring funding into the deal, but we were really in more of a support role of figuring out how two governments might work together. And I was thinking about this question, and, I think a lot of people think that negotiations happen by each party having an interest and sort of only working where there's overlap in interest. And that was not how this deal felt to me, and it's in how we built it. I felt like all three entities had this big shared vision of the win-win of the deal, just how much good we could do in a single deal. And it felt like we were really trying to figure out how we could structure it, given that it's a first of its kind agreement. So I think a lot of the sticking points we were trying to figure out, this was the first time the Strategic Water Reserve, had been approved for use in this part of New Mexico. It was the first environmental water transaction that we think was ever done on the main stem of the San Juan River in New Mexico. And it might have been the first arm's length negotiation between a tribal nation and the state of New Mexico. We couldn't find a lot of examples to use in figuring out like sovereign immunity between two governments. And so I think consistently it was just kind of a grind through these meetings to figure out the details. And it never felt like there was a point that we weren't going to come to consensus on something, no matter how hard we were having to work on it. So I don't know if that's the answer that you expected, but that really was how I felt working on putting together the deal.
Well, I love that. And then it brings me to a question that I ask all of your colleagues, and thing I like to always highlight is how important relationships and trust are in everything that TNC does. And so, I would think for three different parties even though they were all on the same page and had the same, ultimately the same goals, there's just that requires a level of trust to come to the table and really just kind of, assume good intent by all parties and really just kind of skip a lot of the banging against each other and get to the part of really having a shared vision. And so I'd love to how did those relationships get to the point where you could come to the table and everybody knew that everybody had the other people's best interest in mind? And it very well may be because I spent the vast majority of my career in the real estate business where all we did was fight with people. And so maybe I'm scarred because when I was in the conservation world, it was like what you're talking about. But how did those relationships get to the point to where you could have these unbelievably productive negotiations?
They were built over many, many years of working together. So I think between the three entities, we had all worked together in many different ways, including a long tenure of us all serving on the San Juan River Recovery Implementation Program, which is the endangered species recovery program for this basin. Mm-hmm. So some people think that this deal moved pretty fast in water time, but there were years and years of relationship building and trust building before we ever talked about doing this project. And I would say that I also saw that the relationships really deepened as we were working on this project. So I knew some, but not all of our excellent colleagues at the nation and at the Interstate Stream Commission before. But now if we're ever together in person at a conference, it's like we kind of beeline for each other because we do so much on Zoom implementing the agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's cool going through a hard thing like that with other people. You're kind of bonded for life. That's really neat. And so can you kind of give when the deal was signed, like what did that look like? What was the conservation benefit? What was the benefit to the tribal nation? Obviously revenue, a new revenue stream for them, but both in the moment when you signed the deal and now looking back, what have been some of the big key wins that have come from that agreement?
It's so funny. Our marketing staff asked me this question once, and I put together a page of bullet points, and I kind of got some feedback that it might be too much. So
there's no such thing as too much on a podcast, especially with my podcast. We can talk for hours. Just let it rip.
Yeah. So, let's start off with the nation. We have at least partially replaced the revenue source to the nation through this agreement, although there's flexibility in sort of how much water the nation approves to lease to the Interstate Stream Commission in any given year. And one thing that we've learned from the tribal nation is that the uses for this water, which include compact compliance and protection of endangered species, are more aligned with tribal values and how they'd like to see their water used in the San Juan River Basin. And I think that that's something that the Nature Conservancy shares. We're very concerned about both water security and endangered species recovery in this basin. And that's something that the new Mexico Interstate Stream Commission has concerns and responsibilities around as well. We're using a really innovative tool for this project called the Strategic Water Reserve, which allows water to be used for both compact compliance and environmental purposes. So being able to test this tool within the bigger picture of Colorado River Basin stress and tool development is really important for the state of New Mexico and the entire Colorado River Basin. And then we are learning. We have monitoring and adaptive management. So we're learning how we can release this water at different times to benefit the system and the fish at the same time. And, we'll be testing different things over the 10 years of the deal to figure out how best to use this kind of water in that system.
And then last question about this specific deal. When I was working in conservation, I found that whether you're talking to funders or any sort of stakeholders, there's obviously the impact that you want to have on the ground in the area where you're working to help both the people and the landscape in that specific region. But then there's a real bonus that comes if the lessons learned can be applied in other regions of the West or other regions of the world, thinking about TNC. Have there been any either expected or unexpected ripple effects that have come from this deal that you've been able to apply, you or your colleagues have been able to apply to different parts of your work at TNC and beyond?
Yes. And last month, a fairly large group of tribal nations from the basin, I think approaching 20 of the 30, sent a letter in to the federal agencies that are managing the big picture policy negotiations in the basin, really trying to let the federal agencies know what the top tribal priorities are in this negotiation that's going on right now. And one of the kind of three big areas that many tribal nations were able to come together on was about the need for inclusive, what they call flexible tools. You could call them water conservation programs for managing water. Tribal nations are really stepping up and asking for those programs to be more inclusive and to allow for full participation, including the parts of tribal water portfolios that have not yet been developed for use, but are legally set aside for tribes. It's called undeveloped water. And so it's something that tribes have been consistently asking the federal agencies about for more than a decade. And I think that this project is really helping to test and inform how we might build those types of programs. We've been called in to share our work with the 6 Upper Basin tribal nations that are working on these programs. I've been called into the Upper Colorado River Commission to help testify with our partners about this project. So it's not the only tribal leasing project in the basin, but it's an important one. And it's important in that it's being explicit about those sort of multiple benefits in a way that we're not seeing in all parts of the basin right now.
That's really fascinating and also just so complex. The thing about water, when I was working with it for about 4 years, every time I'd learn something new about water and have some breakthrough in my knowledge of water, the only problem was that then that would open up like 10 or 20 new things that I now knew that I didn't know. And so when I hear you just got this so many years of knowledge about that, it's really amazing. So that what a cool project. I appreciate you sharing that with everybody. Izabella, you didn't run off, did you? Are you still there?
I'm sitting here nodding my head like, yeah, Celene.
Well, I got a question for you. Several questions, actually. I had Carissa Bussey on the podcast a while back, and she's doing a lot of work with bison or buffalo, reintroducing buffalo on some of TNC's preserves throughout the country. And then I know, I'm obviously subscribed to all of TNC's newsletters, and I pay close attention to everything TNC is doing. And I know that there is some strategic shifts with how TNC is using its preserves and using the land that it owns and bringing in more indigenous perspectives across the board. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about, I don't know if it's a shift or maybe just a little bit more of an emphasis, but can you just talk about, however much detail you want, some of the things that are happening with TNC strategically as they think about how do we manage all this land that we own?
Yeah, definitely. So one of our core overarching strategies on our preserves is to begin co-creating conservation initiatives with tribal and indigenous partners, which we understand is going to take a lot of learning on our end and a lot of outreach and relationship building to understand what this means to partners and look at how can we do this in a way that truly uplifts them. And so a part of that kind of visioning shift that you said, that's true. We recently have been updating our vision for some of our most iconic preserves around the state to include tribal and indigenous engagement as a main pillar of our work, because we see our preserves as a really important opportunity for engagement. And an example of that is, one of our most iconic preserves, which is the Medano Zapata Ranch, which is outside of the Great Sand Dunes National Park in the San Luis Valley. And we're working to expand this to other preserves as well, but focusing on some key ones for right now. And specifically for the Medano Zapata Ranch, I'm indigenous, but I'm not indigenous to Colorado. But when you go down there, you feel this really powerful sense. And it's probably as best as I can explain it. But, we've aligned around the unique opportunity to position that landscape as a place for cultural reconnection for tribal nations, indigenous communities, and the local San Luis Valley communities. And we're working with a variety of partners right now to explore the best avenues for building this connection, because it is truly a very intertribal region. And like I mentioned, there's also the component of the historic Latino and Hispanic community and other local communities. So we're really working hard to find an approach that works with all of the groups that have a connection to that landscape. And we have two, so it's called the Medano Zapata. So the Medano is where we have our herd of bison, which is about 1,700. Yep. So pretty substantial. And they're again such a stunning backdrop. You have the sand dunes, then you have the mountains. It's just truly so beautiful. The Zapata Ranch is where we have our facilities and lodging. So there truly is a lot of opportunity there. And we're just really excited and fascinated to work with a variety of partners and tribal partners to really understand what this place could be to really serve as that place of cultural reconnection.
Yeah. And the way you describe that valley, and particularly when you're standing on that ranch, I mean, I've spent a few weeks down there if you add it all up, and it really is one of the more special places, almost otherworldly in a lot of ways, especially when you look over and see the sand dunes and like at sunset and you hear the coyotes and you look up and there's, 14,000 foot mountain over there. It's just, it's a wild place. And it really is. There, you can feel the energy in the air there. I mean, it's a really unique place. And so I'd love to hear more about like how do you even begin a process like this? Because I know with the Medano Zapata, that's been it's relatively new initiative. And I think it was announced maybe 6, 8, 9 months ago, maybe. And so like for as much as you can tell, I don't want you to tell, about private conversations or anything, but like, how do you even begin that process of getting indigenous input and getting local input? It just seems like it would almost be overwhelming in a lot of ways. And so like, when you think about gathering all these different perspectives, like how do you do it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's something that we're really learning from as we go along. This is new for us. And kind of as I described, we have a really immense opportunity here, and it's going to take a lot to try to fulfill that. And we have a really incredible team filled with really incredible people. And I think that's helping us delegate. And we also, we're working with Keystone Policy Center and their Center for Tribal and Indigenous Engagement. And they've been a really huge help in helping connect us with certain people and certain tribal representatives to make sure that we truly are thinking of the greater community and how to incorporate these diverse perspectives. I would say we're still in the earlier stages, but we're establishing a strong framework to ensure that, we really do this in a collaborative way and make sure that we are, engaging with tribes and tribal organizations and indigenous communities, and also being, transparent that we're really looking to provide a really collaborative effort.
So whether we're talking about Zapata or just your work in general, I know that you're relatively new to this role. I mean, you've been there about 6 months, if I remember correctly from our earlier conversation. And so it seems to me on the outside looking in, like just the thing that makes or breaks your job is really your ability to build these relationships. But I think that's kind of the case with everybody at TNC in a lot of ways. But it seems very, that is very clear to me. And it seems like you're obviously like super fun to talk to and super smart. But like, as you go out and build these relationships, are there any tactics or strategies that you personally use? And then are there any kind of organizational frameworks maybe that TNC has? I mean, I'd just love to hear more about, because building relationships is hard no matter what. And then, this is my opinion, not y'all's, but it seems that when you're, trying to build relationships between different cultures, that can be possibly even more challenging. So I'd love to hear just more details about how do you think about that, whether it's just your innate ability to do it or your frameworks that TNC has, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's a mixture of both. One framework that we have at the Nature Conservancy, it's called the Voice, Choice, and Action Framework. It's TNC's approach to supporting Indigenous and local community authority and capacity in natural resource management and decision making. And this framework does a really great job to ensure that we're working equitably in conservation. In terms of direct tribal and indigenous engagement, there's varying dynamics based on which group you're working with. And I would say that any good relationship is tailored to what works best for who you're engaging with. Mm-hmm. And that, but there are a few. And so, I would just say there's no one size fits all model to engagement and relationship building. But I would say that there are a few principles that I try to keep in mind that I have found is helpful. And just, I always just try to put myself in the other person's shoes as well and truly be empathetic. But when I approach, relationship building, I really try to come into situations with a listening mindset.
Yeah.
Especially when I'm first meeting people, I just want to get to know each other. I really want to, this is a relationship. It's not just working together. It's deeper than that to me. And so I really just like to listen. And then also I like to be accountable for the work that I do on my end. And so what I mean by that is learning about the community that you're engaging with. I think that lays a good foundation, and also, of course, learning from them, but just being accountable and doing work on your end to kind of understand that community a bit better. And I also find that it's really important to meet in person if possible.
Yes.
I think it's so important. And I think, especially in this really digital age that we're living in, I see the benefits to, Zoom and other online gathering platforms. But I think in terms of relationship building, being in person is really important, and showing up in community is really important. And then I would also say that make sure that what you're working on makes sense for who you're engaging with. It kind of relates to that, putting yourself in the other person's shoes. It shouldn't just be mutually beneficial, but truly uplift and support the work of who you're trying to partner with. And then I would also say that, make sure that you're really cognizant and honor the role or position that, tribal representatives hold, and understand, you're working with tribal nations and that they're sovereign nations, and, and to understand what that means. And also I find too, just to be really clear with your communication and what your intent is. I think that's also really important. So those are some principles that, I keep in mind, and, I'm sure I could think of a few more, but those are some key ones that stand out to me.
No, those are great. You should write a self-help book, because those are just good for life in general too. Like if everybody followed those, we'd be in a much better situation. I love that. So I got a question for both of you, and we'll start with Celene. But this is, the work that both of y'all are doing is so important, and the clock is ticking on a lot of it. It's not, if we could get this work done tomorrow, that would be ideal, but it's just, that's not the way it works. And so, Celene, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do you balance the time that it takes to build relationships and build solid relationships and real relationships. And that's just going to take time. How do you balance that with the idea that time is of the essence? And we got to be on a timeline here, and we got to go as quickly as possible, but it's kind of two extremes, because you don't want to go too fast, because then you don't have good relationships, but you could also spend so much time on the relationships that you never actually push with the deal or whatever the initiative is. So how do you think about that balance between, I don't know, the slowness and authenticity it takes combined with the need for speed?
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. I've been working on a team at the Nature Conservancy looking at our global freshwater work, and I've been helping with some work on equity and inclusion. And I think where I've come to now, and I'm still on my journey, is that I think that might actually be an unhelpful mental model in how we think about this work. I totally feel the urgency. I live in a basin that's in the bullseye of climate change. I'm seeing our forests on fire. I've seen our rivers dry up. I've been in the river with fish kills. So I get it. But I also think that we've done all the easy stuff that we could do alone, and it's time for us to do the other work. It's bigger, it's higher risk, it's scary, it's potentially transformational. We don't do this alone. This is going to be with tribal partners. It's going to be with rural agricultural communities. It's going to be with cities. It's with everyone. And I think the relationship building work is really building the foundation for these bigger things that need to be done fast. And I think that it's building that common vision that I talked about in the Jicarilla Apache Nation and Interstate Stream Commission project. And I think that it's not fuzzy work. It's actually building what we might want to do together. And I think the last thing that I'll mention is I would not have been audacious enough to walk into my friend Daryl's office and propose a deal of the magnitude that we built together. And so in some ways, this is the space that we think of the really big stuff together. And so all of that to say is, I think a lot of our partners feel the urgency and want to move fast. It's figuring out how we can move together in the right way that we need to be focused on.
I love that. I love that, because I fight against it, but I have kind of yes or no, black, white, good, bad mentality. Maybe it's because I'm not as smart as y'all, but I love it when I can, these models that I built in my head, like, no, let's think about it in a fully different way. That makes perfect sense. I really love that. Izabella, do you have anything to add to any of that?
I'll just, reinforce what Celene said, and that I completely am in alignment with that. And that, if we want to move forward, I think we need to realize that rushing relationships can also move us backwards. And that, the way that we may view the phrase time is of the essence may not translate in the same way for others. So we need to make sure that we're aligned in what we're valuing. And if the opportunity makes sense for those involved, then we can find that path forward together in a way that works for everyone. And like Celene said, it takes time, but I think that it holds really deep significance.
And Celene, thinking about things that need to happen in the future, we talked a lot about the 2022 project, but I'd love to hear any specific projects maybe you're working on now or coming up that you're excited about that you can talk about at this point.
So much good stuff. I serve on the leadership team of the Water and Tribes Initiative, and that entity has been advancing just really incredible collaborative governance work with tribal nations, along with some other organizations that are doing the same, the Intertribal Council of Arizona, 10 Tribes Partnership. So, keeping an eye on and participating in these big river governance negotiations and making sure we understand what our tribal partners are asking for and making sure that that's being reflected in our work is going to be a big focus for the next year or so. I also have the privilege of touching and working on a ton of projects around the basin. And one that's kind of near and dear to my heart is in the San Juan River Basin. We've started trying to do the Nature Conservancy's work across the entire watershed. It's really politically fragmented. It's in several states, and we have 4 tribal nation partners in the basin. So really thinking about sort of long-term what we can do at the sort of watershed scale here has been a big focus of my work. And we've been able to bring in a fellow, Lanier Nabahe, who works on our team, who's really been helping us think through what might be possible in the basin. So those are some examples of things I'm working on now.
That's all really exciting. Izabella, you mentioned a few things that you are currently working on, but anything you want to highlight that's kind of coming up and you're excited about?
Yeah, I'd say, besides the learning journey and our new visioning for our preserves, which is really exciting, something else that we're working on that I'm really stoked about is conducting ethnographic assessments and cultural resource surveys to better understand what's on our preserves and ensure that any sacred or cultural items are treated with care and returned home. This is new for TNC, and I think it will really help in building relationships and learning from tribal partners and finding ways to work together and just, and when we're thinking about how to engage on these preserves, doing work on our end to really understand the landscape and what is there so we can communicate that with our tribal and indigenous partners and, find that path forward.
So what does that look like? I mean, like what is there a team of, is it, this may sound dumb, is like archaeologists come out and look around? I mean, what does that process look like of doing that?
Yeah. I will say, we're in the process of finalizing, a consultant to help us with this work. So we've been working with them to help identify a scope of work. And so from what I'm still learning about this process, and it's really fascinating, but there's 2 kind of levels to it. There's the ethnographic assessment, which is broader landscape scale. And then the cultural resource surveys will be more specific to our preserves.
Nice.
So I'm still learning about what it all entails. And we're about to enter into a scope of work process, which will be really telling and we'll learn a lot from. So I'm excited to learn more about that.
Yeah, definitely. And so speaking of learning experiences, Izabella, I'll stay with you on this question and then get Celene's thoughts. But whenever I think about this podcast, it's a very, very selfish project because I want to learn all this stuff. And then I'm just lucky that all these other people want to listen to my very public learning process. But one of the things that I'd love to get from y'all is some resources, or, I mean, it could be, websites, could be books, could be films, whatever. But resources that you could recommend to me and therefore to the listeners of ways to kind of, for curious people who want to learn more and get their head around some of the more almost like philosophical, or it could be down to the detailed ideas around understanding Indigenous perspectives from the outside. And I know when we were talking the other day, you named quite a few that I wrote down, I thought were really helpful and I need to dig in. And so I was wondering if you could just share any resources that you have that may be helpful for somebody like me.
Yeah. So as a part of the learning journey that we're doing with staff, another component that I forgot to mention is we're leading cohorts to complete this training called Indian Country 101. And it's completely open to the public. It's an online tribal engagement training that was built with natural resource practitioners in mind. We noticed that it's important when working with tribes to have some sort of understanding of the long and complicated history. And it lays out the history and context for tribal engagement throughout the country. So the way that this came to be is the Nature Conservancy's Washington chapter partnered with the Whitener Group, which is a tribal member-owned consulting firm, to create this training. And it's really great because the Whitener Group has ownership over the content, and then TNC owns the content delivery. So there's shared ownership there. And it's broken down into 3 different sections. The first section is crash course in Native history in the U.S., and then tribal governments today. And then the third is identity, citizenship, and culture. It's a really incredible training. I finished it recently, and we're leading our first cohort through it, and just had the Whitener Group come do a kickoff, and everyone's really excited about it. So we'll have some discussions along the training with our group, so we can have discussion and kind of just have a little community to share on how we're feeling about what we're learning. And so that's open to everyone. I completely recommend it. I think it takes about 10 hours total. If you're like me, it'll take a bit longer because I'm a slow reader, first of all. And second of all, there's a lot of really great links and videos, so you can really dive deep into whichever topic, is really interesting you. And there's just so many great call outs to really awesome tribal and Indigenous organizations and different companies to support. So it's really great. They did a really great job. And then also I'll say too that they also, for any Washington folks or anyone who wants to learn more about Washington tribes, they have a 102 that's specific for working with Washington tribes. And they built it. And I would also say that as a part of our North America Indigenous Right Relations program, they're working to build more of these 102s throughout the country. So we're in the early stages of thinking of how this would look for Colorado and how we can, create content with tribal and Indigenous partners to have a training more tailored to tribal and Indigenous people and, what we know now as Colorado. And I will also say that in terms of podcasts, I'm a big podcast person. One of my favorites is called All My Relations, and it's hosted by 2 Indigenous women that explore relationships, and that includes relationships to the land, environment, and to each other. They cover a lot of really important issues and elements in Indigenous life, and they're also really funny and real easy to listen to. And I'd say another resource that I really love is one of my favorite documentaries. It's called Inhabitants, and it's on Prime, I believe, Peacock. Okay. And then from their website, you can rent or buy it. And so the film follows several Native communities across the U.S. and how they maintain and strengthen their traditional relationships with the land, which, that relationship has been greatly impacted due to colonization. And it shows just how resilient Indigenous people are. And, as climate change impacts continue to be felt, the practices and knowledges of Indigenous people are really crucial. And those relationships are centered in reciprocity, respect, and balance with the environment. And those are the kind of relationships that we're going to need to really protect our land.
Nice. Those are great recommendations. Thank you. I'll have links to all that in the episode notes so people, if you're driving your car, you don't need to be writing all this stuff down. You can click through at a later time. Celene, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I'm gonna display that I'm an attorney by training, but there's a blog called Turtle Talk that Matthew Fletcher does that really covers a wide array of Indian law topics, but he's really engaging and funny, and it's where I go to learn about how things are happening in real time. And I also am a podcast fan. If you hadn't picked that up already, I really enjoyed Rebecca Nagel's This Land podcast. And again, it's kind of showing that I'm a nerdy attorney there. And then finally, I think Robin Wall Kimmerer is a pretty well-known and influential Indigenous thinker, but she's got an essay that was published in 2022 called The Serviceberry that's been really impactful. And I believe she has a book with the same title coming out later this year. And just it's been really impactful and transformational for me to read her work.
And I found the Serviceberry online, the essay, and you can click on it and you can hear her read it too. So that's because I've always, people always talk about how much they love Braiding Sweetgrass, particularly the audiobook, because she reads it and she's got just an amazing voice. So I'll link to that so people can either read or listen. Those are really great. Celene, you mentioned your attorney training. And I'm just curious, we could do a whole podcast with both of y'all about this, but why conservation? I mean, you could be doing anything you want. And then, you narrow that down to the legal world. There's a million different ways you could go in that world. And yet you've chosen to spend your brain power and your time and your energy working on this conservation work. I mean, is that something that you've felt the need to do your whole life, or how did you come to decide I'm going to use my brains for the greater good?
Well, when I was a really little kid, I thought I wanted to be an astronaut or a fighter pilot, but I have terrible vision. And so that got quashed pretty early. But I knew from early on that I wanted to work on climate and environmental issues. And I don't know if my parents intended for that, but they raised us for a good chunk of my childhood in an off-grid solar-powered house that backed into the Plumas National Forest in Northern California.
Oh, wow.
At a time when my grandparents, who lived in the same community, all their friends were working on the Quincy Library Group, which was like early collaborative planning around these wicked problems. That one was Mexican spotted owl and forestry in the area. So I think sort of the collaborative work, the through line of working on equity and conservation has been there since a pretty early age, and working with Indigenous people and becoming a parent has just deepened that commitment over time.
Izabella, how about you?
Yeah. I'll just say that, I feel really fortunate that I was able, to grow up in my community on the reservation and with my traditions that really built the foundation of who I am. And a lot of our teachings and ways of life revolve around being in harmony with each other and with the environment. And, we all have roles to be caretakers of the earth. And, we don't see ourselves as above Mother Nature, but as an integral part of it. And I was just grown up to have really deep feelings of gratitude for my environment. And I didn't have a lot growing up, but I really thank my family because I never really felt that. Like I felt such richness because we spent so much time outside and we had those traditions and just, I was felt with so much gratitude. So I really thank my family and my community for really instilling those deep values of appreciating your environment. And, I always knew I wanted to be in environmental work, I think because of that. Mm-hmm. And, that's what a lot of my background is in. I got a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and went on to work with natural resource management and environmental education. So I've explored a few different aspects in environmental work. But honestly, it wasn't until COVID where I really took a step back and was trying to think about how to make this work connect more with who I am. And so I really thought, and I was like, what really matters to me, which is not only protecting the environment, but ensuring that Indigenous people are uplifted and a major part of that conversation. So I'm just, sometimes I have to pinch myself that I'm in this job, and I'm just really honored to be here and to combine those two really, really big pillars of who I am, and that they can really work well together. So that's kind of how I got here, and just really, really honored to be where I am.
I'm very much impressed and also like in awe of how you have your act together, because when I was your age, I was fully focused. I was like, I want to be a real estate developer and I want to turn ranches into golf courses. And, and so like thankfully I did about a 180. And so now I'm a conservation guy with a podcast, but, I'm very impressed with both of y'all and just your full, really like lifelong commitment to doing this work. You didn't have to get it knocked into you like I did. But it's so impressive. And Izabella, outside of your family, have there been any heroes or mentors? And they could be people it could be people you've read about in books or people you've watched movies about. Anybody that outside of your family that you would point to that's been a, kind of a positive influence in your career and this journey in conservation?
Yeah, definitely. I know this might get into the book section, but I will also say, and highlighting what Celene noted about Robin Wall Kimmerer, that she, and I heard you, Ed, mention her Braiding Sweetgrass book. And to me, that is just such a really profound book, and it's become quite popular for good reason. And I do suggest everyone reads it. There's just so many beautiful teachings in that book. And I really had to take my time because I truly wanted to savor every chapter. Her voice carries throughout that book so well. And I've heard some of the audio book chapters, and it just lulls me. But yeah, this book was really inspiring to me because I think it shows you that you can be in the environmental science field and still be true to your culture, and that Indigenous principles can greatly enrich science and conservation. And, Indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge are ever evolving and have been tested throughout time through careful observation and practice. And, I think her highlighting that really was a moment for me that really shifted my perspective and helped show me that I can, braid these two parts of myself in a way that can be really, really beautiful. And she does make a really great point, though, that I'll say that, these two ways of knowing that they shouldn't be mixed, which can dilute the integrity of it, but instead woven to support one another, and I just thought that was a really beautiful way to look at that, So the Indigenous worldviews that she shares in that book, it really shows a different life or a different light to conservation, and that, humans are really integral and not separate, and that really working to restore land and relationships. And I think conservation is getting there. But I think, as we can incorporate and think about these Indigenous worldviews and really uplift Indigenous people, I think conservation, the goal there, right, is to really uplift the environment. And I think we really need Indigenous people to do that. So I'd say that book was really foundational for me. And then in terms of other people that I actually know, I hope to meet Robin Wall Kimmerer one day. That's a dream. But
I bet you will.
But I would say other mentors besides my family that I just want to say, I want to highlight my mom. I know I already talked about my family, but I just want to highlight my mom because, she is my biggest influence. She's the cultural manager on our reservation in Michigan. And she just truly embodies staying connected to your culture and working to uplift the community while also caring for the environment. So I just have to put a plug in for her because I the older I get, the more I'm realizing that I'm becoming her, but I've never been more excited about it. And so I just, I really thank her because I go to her for a lot of things and she's just really grounding to me. But,
well, does she provide parenting advice? If I call her up, can she?
You know what? Sometimes I make her relive some of her parenting techniques and she's like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. But she's been so great. And, but yeah, she's very wise. She's very wise. Yeah. She's a good time. She's a good time. But I'll just, put one more plug in for my mentors from school. I've been really fortunate to be a part of some really incredible programs. One of them being, CU Denver has this program called Environmental Stewardship of Indigenous Lands. And I learned a lot from my professors and my academic advisors. They really influenced me in my desire to be in this work as a tribal liaison for natural resource matters. So it's a really great program. Plug it there as well. And then I'll say that I'm finishing up my master's right now from another really great program out of the University of Minnesota Duluth called Master of Tribal Resources and Environmental Stewardship, where I've had the opportunity to learn from really incredible professors and classmates on so many topics related to tribal natural resource management, tribal sovereignty, federal Indian law, and Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And, my classmates were from tribes all over and some that didn't have tribal background. So it was a really great cohort that we had. And my professors were also really monumental to helping me be where I'm at today. So I just want to say a huge thank you and plug for both of those programs and all the people involved in it.
Those are all really great. Celene, do you have any? I mean, you've got so many people that you've worked with over the years. I would imagine you've got kind of a unlimited, long list of amazing people that have influenced you.
I do. I've been so fortunate in my career and to learn from people who are more experienced and less experienced than me. I'm choking up a little bit saying this. I had just the most fantastic opportunity to study with Charles Wilkinson at CU Law, and he passed away, and I'm still struggling with it. But to get to study with him, but also to do his Colorado Plateau field seminar, I still use lessons learned from the time with him about my work. And I think the one that I think about the most is just the absolute joy that he carried everywhere with him and enthusiasm. And I also worked with Sarah Krakoff at CU Law. She's now doing very important work at the Department of Interior, and I learned a ton from her. I almost can't name all of the people in the sort of tribal water community who have taught me and helped me over my career. It wasn't only leaders at the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe. I was really involved in the 10 Tribes Partnership, and there were so many tribal leaders, attorneys, and staff people along the way that have taught me. But two people that I still keep in touch with and that spent, I would say, extra time with me are Regina Lopez White Skunk, who was an elected tribal leader when I worked at the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe and is now doing really incredible work on the Bears Ears National Monument and at Montezuma Land Conservancy here in southwestern Colorado. And then Vice Chairman Lorelei Cloud and I have worked together for a long time in a number of different ways. And I've just learned a lot about finding my place as a leader in the water community from her and just really appreciate her. And then I just wanted to mention a couple of other places. I served 2 terms on the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and I'm just ever grateful to Becky Mitchell, Lauren Riss, the staff and attorneys that do the good work on that board. And then, I've learned a lot from people who kind of developed in their careers at the same time, more of peer learning, but I'm thinking of Leland Begay, who's now the Attorney General at the White Mountain Apache Tribe, Ethel Branch, who's the Attorney General at the Navajo Nation, Daniel and Amy Cordalis, who are both doing just really incredible work. We all kind of started our careers together, and I'm kind of watching in awe as they do really transformational, incredible work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the thing. In my experience is when you're in this conservation community, it's just everybody is so inspiring because everybody is so smart and so focused and so purpose driven. And they really could be applying that to a lot of different things. And it's just such a great group of people. And for people listening, maybe new listeners, Lorelei Cloud was on the podcast almost exactly a year ago, and it was a real honor to get to talk to her and hear her story. And she's an all-star. We talk a lot about the Colorado Water Conservation Board and that, so you can go back and listen to that one. Celene, I'll stay on you. Books, any good books you got? And it doesn't have to be about conservation, doesn't have to be about water, just any books that have played a role in your development as an awesome human.
Well, when I was in grad school, I read an essay, and I'm not even sure which one it was, about indigenous removal in national parks. And it really changed it changed the course of my studies and career. And so I think there's been so much good scholarship since then. That was a long time ago. And just, if I had to recommend something, it'd be David Trower's 2021 article in The Atlantic called Return the National Parks to the Tribes. I think that's just a really powerful piece along the same theme. Okay. I'm a huge Michael Pollan fan. I love all of his books, but The Omnivore's Dilemma really helped me understand some links between food and colonization in North America. It put together a piece of the puzzle that I hadn't quite thought about before. And then his more recent, This Is Your Mind on Plants, really made me feel bad about my caffeine addiction. So really good stuff.
Well, even he admitted that he tried to get off caffeine. I haven't read that, but I've seen interviews with him, and he said he got off for maybe 3 months, and he said he couldn't function, so he had to get back on. So I feel the same way sometimes, but don't beat yourself up. Izabella, do you have any books to add? You mentioned Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Yeah, that one is, I'd say, one of my big ones. And another book I really, really loved enjoying is called The Secret Network of Nature, and like trying to lean over to my bookshelf to remember the name of the author. Peter Wallenburn? Peter Wallen something. And his book is really, he's done a couple books. I have another one of his I've been really excited to read. It's called The Hidden Life of Trees. But The Secret Network of Nature is really beautiful. It talks about how everything is connected and the importance of looking at things holistically, and just reminds you of how beautifully complicated the natural world is, and that the things that we do really have impact. And I totally recommend it. It's really, really well done. And I will say it's been, as I've been going through expanding my education the past few years, I have a little time to read for fun, but I will say that I have really enjoyed a lot of textbooks and readings that I've been assigned to. But some books that I have started that I have really been enjoying is The Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States.
That's good.
It's really good. It's, history of the U.S., but told from an Indigenous perspective, which is so important because that narrative has been missing from mainstream history, which can be really damaging to Indigenous people. So it's a really good book. So I totally recommend that one. And another one that I started reading is called As Long as the Grass Grows, about the environmental justice movement and how Indigenous people are such an integral part of that. A lot of history in there as well. And then one more book that I actually did get to complete last summer was called Fresh Banana Leaves, which is another really impactful story of an Indigenous woman who is in environmental science and breaks down why Western forms of conservation just aren't working alone, and offering Indigenous models to this framework to really enhance science and really ensure that we're protecting this protecting this environment that we're gifted. And she really emphasizes, the importance of having Indigenous people as part of the conversation. And also just done really well.
Cool. Those were great. Celene, anything to add?
The only other thing, and I have mixed feelings about recommending it, but it was pretty influential earlier on. The Monkey Wrench Gang, I've read that book aloud in Cataract Canyon, in the Grand Canyon, on these big epic rafting trips in the Colorado River Basin. And I have kind of a love-hate relationship with it. I loved thinking about kind of radical change and what that would look like in the basin. And I had a hard time with the perspective that centered certain privileges and denied so many others. So I kind of included as something that made me think hard and that I'm not totally comfortable recommending.
No, those are great. I love that. I love books like that. I met Doug Peacock. I hung out with him. Hey, Duke.
Wow.
Yeah, he's been on the podcast. He and we've stayed in touch, and he's the real deal. He is I don't know. I mean, the Hey Duke thing is not far off in a lot of ways from his approach to saving grizzly bears and saving the environment. So people can listen to that. One of the characters in Monkey Wrench Gang is named Hey Duke, and it's based on this guy Doug Peacock. So yeah, I love books like that I don't fully agree with, that make me think, either bolster my already held opinions or make me change my opinions. I love that. Any other ones?
Hey, there's probably too many, but those are the ones that come to mind.
No, those are great. We could just do a whole podcast on books. All right. Last question for you both. Any kind of final words of wisdom, anything I missed, anything that just to kind of wrap up this amazing conversation?
Yeah. Well, my family lost my brother a little over a year ago. So I've spent a lot of time in grief. And I share that just to kind of share the wisdom that has come out of that. And that's that life can be short. It can be unexpectedly short. So do the right things, do the scary things, do the interesting things now, because you never know.
Very wise words. And I'm sorry about your brother. Izabella?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Celene, for sharing that. That was really beautiful. I lost my grandmother a little over a year ago as well, which has been hard on me. And so I share that same sentiment. So thank you for sharing that. But I think something that comes to mind for me that helps me stay grounded in myself is, in my language, we have this phrase called Mino Bamadazuin, which translates to the good life. And that means, in leading the good life, to be on a good path, which is a collective sense of well-being and being in good relations with each other, flowing from our traditional ways. But that can translate to anyone's culture. And that saying just really grounds me and helps me stay true to who I am, and my relationships with community and people and to the land, and just stay connected with my morals and remember why I'm here and let that guide me. So yeah, just be true to yourself, listen to yourself, but also be easy on yourself. Life is hard. Life gets complicated. So just make sure that, you give yourself some grace.
I especially needed that last piece of advice. No, well, y'all, I really, really appreciate this. That was such a educational, conversation, but more importantly, I really appreciate y'all being so open with your thoughts on the philosophy of all this stuff and just being so willing to share so much. It's really, really inspiring. And I hope we can hang out in person. We need to do a part 2 of this in person one of these days. But I just seriously, I know it's a big time commitment to get on here and let some weirdo like me ask you questions all day, but I really, really, really appreciate it. Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number 1, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number 2, you go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.